The crack of skin against skin echoed in the stale air of Courtroom 3B, a sound so sharp and ugly it seemed to physically suck the oxygen from the room. Every person present, the jaded judge, the ambitious prosecutor, the overworked public defender, the bored bailiffs, froze in a collective intake of breath. Officer Frank Miller stood over the defendant's table, his hand still raised, his face a mask of contemptuous rage. Seated before him was Jamal Hayes, a 17-year-old boy whose only crime was a broken taillight. Now a victim of assault in the one place that promised justice. His head was turned by the force of the blow, a single tear tracing a path on his cheek. In that deafening silence, a heavy oak door at the back of the courtroom swung open, and a man walked in. He wasn't loud or aggressive, but the entire room turned, captured by an aura of absolute authority that would change everything. The prelude to the courtroom drama began on a Tuesday afternoon under the hazy, indifferent sky of suburban Charlotte, North Carolina. Jamal Hayes was driving his mother's 10-year-old but impeccably maintained Toyota Camry, a car he'd washed and waxed just 2 days prior. He was on his way home from a robotics club meeting at his high school, where he was a senior with a 4.2 GPA and a full scholarship offer to Georgia Tech for electrical engineering pending. The future was a bright, intricate schematic in his mind, and life was a series of problems to be solved with logic and precision. The flashing blue and red lights that suddenly filled his rearview mirror were a problem he hadn't anticipated. His heart rate kicked up a notch, the familiar anxiety that every black parent drills into their son tightening his chest. He immediately remembered the litany of rules his father had taught him. Pull over immediately and safely, turn off the engine, turn on the interior dome light, place both hands on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 position, and do not make any sudden movements. He followed the instructions perfectly, pulling into the parking lot of a closed-down hardware store. He watched in the mirror as the police cruiser, a Ford Interceptor, parked behind him. The door opened and Officer Frank Miller emerged. Miller was a man who seemed permanently coiled, his stocky frame straining against the fabric of his uniform. He had a face that looked like it had been set in a perpetual scowl, and his movements were heavy with a sense of self-importance that preceded him like a physical force. Jamal rolled down his window as Miller approached, keeping his hands firmly on the wheel. "Afternoon, officer," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline. Miller didn't return the greeting. He leaned down, his sunglasses failing to hide the disdain in his eyes as he scanned the interior of the car, lingering on Jamal's face. "You know why I pulled you over, son?" The word son was laced with condescension, not affection. "No, sir, I don't believe I do," Jamal replied respectfully. "Your right side taillight is out. That's a moving violation," Miller said, his tone accusatory, as if Jamal had personally designed the bulb to fail at that exact moment. "Oh, I'm sorry, officer, I wasn't aware. My mother and I just checked the lights last week. It must have just happened." Miller's lip curled into a sneer. "License and registration." This was the part his father had warned him about most. The reach, he called it, the moment of highest danger. "Yes, officer," Jamal said slowly and clearly. "My wallet is in my back right pocket, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I am going to reach for my wallet first. Is that okay?" Miller just grunted, his hand resting on the holstered firearm at his hip. Jamal moved with deliberate slowness, retrieving his wallet and handing over his license. Then he announced his intention to open the glove compartment. He found the registration and the insurance card, neatly clipped together by his mother, and handed them over. Miller took the documents and studied the license. "Jamal Hayes, you live over on Crestwood Drive?" "Yes, sir." "That's a nice neighborhood," Miller said, his eyes scanning Jamal again. "This your car?" "It's my mother's, sir." "Your mother? What's she do for a living?" The question was irrelevant and probing, but Jamal knew better than to challenge it. "She's a nurse manager at Atrium Health, sir." Miller was silent for a moment, flipping the registration over in his hand. He seemed almost disappointed by the legitimate answers. He was hunting for something, a discrepancy, a reason to escalate. He found none. He walked back to his patrol car without another word. Jamal let out a slow breath. He figured Miller was running his name, and since he had a perfectly clean record, not even a parking ticket, This would all be over soon. He'd get a warning or a fix-it ticket and be on his way. He just had to remain calm. 10 long minutes passed. Jamal could see Miller in his car, not on the radio, but on his phone. It was strange. Finally, Miller got out and walked back to Jamal's window, this time with a harder edge to his posture. "All right, Mr. Hayes," Miller said, his voice now dangerously low. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Jamal's blood ran cold. "Officer, is there a problem? Did I do something wrong?" "I just gave you a lawful order. Step out of the car. Now." This was the gray area, the place where compliance could be twisted. "Sir, with all due respect, am I being detained or am I free to go?" It was a phrase his father, a man who understood the letter of the law intimately, had taught him, a phrase designed to clarify his legal standing. For Officer Miller, it was a lit match in a room full of gasoline. His face flushed a deep, blotchy red. "You think you're a lawyer? You think you're smart? You're being detained because I said so," he barked, his voice cracking with fury. He reached for the door handle. "Get out of the car." Jamal, knowing that refusing now would only make things worse, put his hands up in the air to show they were empty and slowly opened the door. The moment he was on his feet, Miller grabbed his arm, twisted it violently behind his back, and slammed him against the side of the Toyota. Jamal's head hit the roof pillar with a dull thud, and spots danced in his vision. "Stop resisting," Miller yelled, though Jamal was doing nothing of the sort. He was limp, overwhelmed by shock and the sudden explosion of violence. "I'm not resisting, sir. I'm not resisting," Jamal cried out, his voice muffled against the car. Miller wrenched Jamal's other arm back, the pressure on his shoulder excruciating. He slapped handcuffs on his wrists, ratcheting them down so tightly they bit into his skin. He then spun Jamal around and shoved him toward the police cruiser. "What is this for? What did I do?" Jamal pleaded, his mind reeling. Miller offered no explanation. He simply shoved Jamal into the back of the cruiser, the hot plastic of the seat sticking to his skin. He slammed the door, and the world was reduced to a cage of steel mesh and thick plexiglass. Miller got in the driver's seat and finally spoke, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "You're under arrest for failure to obey a lawful order and resisting arrest. Let's see how that engineering scholarship holds up with a criminal record." As they pulled away, Jamal looked back at his mother's car, abandoned in the parking lot. He saw the taillight in question. It was shining perfectly. The hours that followed were a blur of institutional gray and dehumanizing procedure. At the Mecklenburg County Jail, Jamal was processed not as a person, but as a case file. His photo was taken, his fingerprints were scanned, and his personal belongings, his phone, his wallet, the key to his mother's car, were cataloged and sealed in a plastic bag. He used his one phone call to contact his mother, a conversation that was a torrent of her panicked questions and his own shaky, bewildered answers. His mother, Maria Hayes, was a force of nature, a woman of deep compassion and fierce protective instincts. But against the monolithic machinery of the justice system, she was rendered powerless. She was told Jamal would be held until his arraignment the next morning. She couldn't see him. She couldn't post bail yet. All she could do was wait and worry and pray. Jamal spent the night in a holding cell with 10 other men. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, despair, and industrial-grade disinfectant. The concrete bench was cold and unyielding. Sleep was impossible. He replayed the traffic stop over and over in his mind, dissecting every word, every action, searching for the moment it had all gone wrong. He had followed every rule. He had been polite. He had been respectful. And yet here he was, charged with crimes he did not commit, his future hanging by a thread woven from a lie. The next morning, he was herded with a group of other detainees into a larger holding pen adjacent to the courtrooms. It was there he met his court-appointed public defender, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins. She had kind eyes but a weary expression that spoke of too many cases and too few resources. She held a thin manila folder with his name on it. "Jamal Hayes?" she asked, her voice quiet amidst the din. "I'm Sarah Jenkins. I'll be representing you today." They found a small corner to talk, their conversation a hurried whisper. Jamal recounted the events of the previous day, his voice filled with the earnest desperation of the innocent. He explained the lies, the unprovoked aggression, the perfectly functional taillight. Sarah listened patiently, nodding, her pen scratching notes on a yellow legal pad. When he finished, she gave him a sympathetic but grim look. "I believe you, Jamal," she said, and he felt a flicker of hope. "But I need you to understand what we're up against. The charge is failure to obey and resisting without violence. The prosecutor is Mark Riley. He's ambitious and has a reputation for being tough on what he calls disrespect for law enforcement. The judge is Annabeth Collins. She runs her courtroom like a factory assembly line. She wants to clear her docket, and she generally trusts the testimony of police officers." "But he lied," Jamal insisted. "The taillight wasn't broken. He assaulted me." "None of it is true." "I know," Sarah said softly, "but in that courtroom, it's your word against the sworn testimony of a decorated police officer. Officer Frank Miller has been on the force for 15 years. He has commendations. He's also had a dozen civilian complaints filed against him for everything from excessive force to racial profiling. Every single one of them was dismissed by Internal Affairs as unfounded. He knows the system, and he knows how to use it." The flicker of hope in Jamal's chest died, replaced by a cold dread. "So what happens? What do we do?" "The prosecutor will likely offer you a plea deal," Sarah explained. "They'll probably offer to drop the resisting charge if you plead guilty to failure to obey. You'd get probation, maybe some community service, and a fine. It would go on your record as a misdemeanor." "A record?" Jamal's voice was barely a whisper. "But I didn't do anything. A record could affect my scholarship, my whole future." "This is the choice they force you to make," Sarah said, her voice tinged with a bitterness that came from seeing this scenario play out time and time again. "You can take the deal and accept a punishment for a crime you didn't commit to guarantee you go home today. Or you can plead not guilty, fight the charges, and risk a trial where, if you lose, you could face jail time and a much more serious conviction." The choice was an illusion. It was a threat dressed up as an option. Pleading guilty felt like a betrayal of himself, of the truth. But the thought of a trial, of his fate resting in the hands of a system that was already predisposed to believe his accuser, was terrifying. "I can't plead guilty," Jamal said, his jaw set. The fear was still there, but beneath it, a core of indignation was hardening into resolve. "I can't. My father, he always told me to stand for what's right, no matter how hard it is." He hadn't been able to reach his father. David Hayes worked for the federal government, a job that involved a lot of travel and long periods of being unreachable. His mother had left him a dozen frantic messages, but they hadn't heard back yet. Jamal felt the absence of his father's calm, steadying presence like a physical ache. Sarah Jenkins looked at the fierce determination in the young man's eyes and sighed. "Okay, Jamal. Okay, we fight, but you need to be prepared. It's going to get ugly in there." An hour later, shackled at the wrists and ankles, Jamal was led into courtroom 3B. The room was smaller and dingier than he'd imagined. The air was heavy, the wood of the benches worn smooth by decades of anxious hands. At the prosecutor's table sat a man with slicked back hair and a smug grin, Mark Riley. At the defense table, Sarah Jenkins gave him a small, encouraging nod. On the raised dais sat Judge Annabeth Collins, her face a mask of bored impatience as she rattled through the morning's cases. And sitting in the front row of the gallery, his uniform crisp and his posture radiating smug confidence, was Officer Frank Miller. He caught Jamal's eye and gave a subtle, triumphant smirk. In that moment, Jamal Hayes understood that this wasn't about a broken taillight or a lawful order. This was about power, and he had none. Docket number 2025, CR 741, the state versus Jamal Hayes. The bailiff's voice droned, devoid of any emotion. Charges are 1 count of failure to obey a lawful order and 1 count of resisting an officer without violence. Sarah Jenkins stood. "Public Defender Sarah Jenkins for Mr. Hayes, Your Honor. We plead not guilty to all charges." Judge Collins peered over her glasses, her gaze sweeping over Jamal for a fraction of a second before dismissing him. "Is the state ready to proceed with the probable cause hearing?" "We are, Your Honor," Prosecutor Mark Riley said, rising smoothly to his feet. The state calls Officer Frank Miller to the stand. Miller walked to the witness stand with a practiced swagger. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore the oath without a hint of irony, and sat down. He looked directly at the judge, a picture of dutiful public service. Riley began his questioning. Officer Miller, could you please recount the events of yesterday afternoon, August 25th? Certainly, Miller began, his voice a deep, authoritative baritone. At approximately 15:30 hours, I was on patrol when I observed a 2015 Toyota Camry driving with a non-functioning right rear taillight. I initiated a lawful traffic stop. The driver, the defendant Mr. Hayes, immediately became belligerent and uncooperative. A lie, the first of many. Jamal felt a hot surge of anger. He looked at Sarah, who placed a calming hand on his arm. In what way was he belligerent, officer? Riley prompted. He was argumentative from the start, Miller said, shaking his head with faux disappointment. When I asked for his license and registration, he began questioning my authority, asking if he was being detained, using lawyer talk. His tone was hostile. Based on his aggressive demeanor and furtive movements, I became concerned for my safety and asked him to step out of the vehicle. And did he comply? No, he refused. He stated he wasn't going anywhere. I had to repeat the command 3 times before he finally exited the vehicle, at which point he squared up to me in a threatening posture. I moved to detain him, and he began to actively resist, pulling his arms away and trying to break free. I was forced to use a standard armbar takedown to subdue him and place him in handcuffs for his safety and my own. Every word was a fabrication, a grotesque distortion of the truth. Jamal's hands clenched into fists under the table. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him, judging him based on the fiction being spun by this man in a uniform. Thank you, officer. No further questions, Your Honor, Riley said, sitting down with a satisfied expression. Judge Collins turned her gaze to the defense table. Ms. Jenkins, your witness. Sarah Jenkins approached the stand. Officer Miller, you've been on the force for 15 years, is that correct? That's right. And in those 15 years, you've conducted thousands of traffic stops? Probably, Miller said with a shrug. And you're aware of the standard procedure, which includes activating your body camera and the mobile video recorder in your vehicle during any such interaction? Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. Of course. So the court can expect to see the video evidence of this entire encounter, which will surely corroborate your testimony? Sarah asked, her voice steady. Riley shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Assumes facts, not in evidence. Before the judge could rule, Miller answered smoothly. Unfortunately, due to a technical malfunction, my body camera failed to activate, and the MVR system in my vehicle was recently flagged for repairs. So no, there is no footage. It was a perfect pre-packaged excuse, unprovable, unverifiable. Sarah knew it was a lie. Miller knew it was a lie. And deep down, she suspected the judge knew it was a lie. But it was a plausible one, and that was all that mattered. A technical malfunction, Sarah repeated, letting the words hang in the air. How convenient. Officer, you testified that Mr. Hayes' taillight was out. Was a citation for the broken taillight ever issued? Miller shifted in his seat. The non-functioning light was the reason for the initial stop. The criminal charges that arose from his subsequent behavior took precedence. So you arrested a young man for resisting and failure to obey, charges that stem from a traffic stop for an infraction you never actually cited him for? Objection, Riley snapped. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Collins said, looking bored. Ms. Jenkins, do you have a point, or are you just fishing? My point, Your Honor, is that the entire pretext for this stop was a fabrication, Sarah said, her voice rising with passion. The taillight wasn't broken. Mr. Hayes was profiled, harassed, and assaulted by this officer, who then invented these charges to cover his own misconduct. Miller scoffed on the stand. That's a ridiculous accusation. Is it? Sarah pressed. Isn't it true, Officer Miller, that you've had 12 separate civilian complaints filed against you for excessive force and racial profiling in the last 5 years alone? Objection, Riley yelled, genuinely angry now. Counsel is trying to introduce prior bad acts. This is completely inadmissible and prejudicial. Sustained! Judge Collins slammed her gavel. Ms. Jenkins, that is enough. You are on thin ice. Unless you have concrete evidence to present, I suggest you wrap up your cross-examination. Sarah's shoulders slumped in defeat. She had no evidence. It was their word against his. She had fired her only shot, and it had been deflected by the system's built-in shields. No further questions, she mumbled, returning to her seat. Judge Collins looked down at Jamal, her expression hardening. Mr. Hayes, I have heard the sworn testimony of an officer of the law. He describes a young man with a dangerous attitude problem who chose to escalate a simple traffic stop into a criminal event. Frankly, I find his testimony credible. The injustice of it all was a physical weight on Jamal's chest, suffocating him. All his life he had done everything right. He'd followed the rules, respected his elders, studied hard, and stayed out of trouble. And for what? To be dragged into a courtroom and have his character assassinated by a liar with a badge, to be believed by no one. He couldn't help it. The words escaped him in a quiet, desperate plea, not meant for the judge, but for the universe itself. That's not what happened. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the tense silence of the courtroom, it was as loud as a shout. Officer Miller, who had just stepped down from the witness stand and was walking back to the gallery, stopped dead in his tracks. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Jamal. He heard the whisper not as a plea, but as a challenge, a direct affront to his authority, to the lies he had so carefully constructed. Judge Collins' eyes flashed with anger. Mr. Hayes, you will be silent, or I will hold you in contempt. But Miller was already moving. The carefully maintained facade of the professional officer dissolved in an instant, revealing the raw, ugly rage beneath. He saw not a scared teenager, but a symbol of everything he despised, a young black man he deemed arrogant, who he felt had disrespected him, and who was now publicly questioning his word. He took 3 quick strides toward the defense table. Sarah Jenkins saw him coming and instinctively rose, her mouth open to object. Your Honor! It was too late. Before the bailiffs could react, before the judge could fully process what was happening, Miller reached across the table. With an open palm, he slapped Jamal Hayes across the face. The sound was obscene, a sharp, percussive crack that violated the sanctimonious quiet of the courtroom. It wasn't the sound of a scuffle or a fight. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated dominance, the sound of a man in power striking a boy in chains. For a single eternal second, the world stopped. Jamal's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. The sting was immediate, a blooming flower of pain on his left cheek, but it was nothing compared to the shock, the sheer, unbelievable audacity of the act. To be physically assaulted by a police officer in a courtroom in front of a judge. A hot tear of humiliation and rage sprang from his eye, tracing a path through the stinging redness of his skin. The collective gasp of the small gallery was a soft, whooshing sound, like the last breath leaving a dying body. Sarah Jenkins stood frozen, her hand half extended, her mind unable to form a coherent legal objection to an event so far outside the bounds of protocol. It felt like a scene from a nightmare. Prosecutor Mark Riley's smug expression had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed look of horror. Not of moral outrage, but of an ambitious lawyer watching his clean, simple case detonate into a catastrophic mess. The 2 bailiffs, who had been standing impassively by the walls, were suddenly jolted into motion, their training kicking in a half-second too late. Judge Annabeth Collins shot to her feet, her face a storm cloud of fury. The boredom and impatience were gone, replaced by the incandescent rage of a captain whose ship had just been mutinied in her own harbor. Officer Miller, what in God's name do you think you are doing? She thundered, her voice shaking the very foundations of the room. Miller, breathing heavily, seemed to come back to himself. He looked down at his own hand, then at Jamal, and a flicker of panic entered his eyes. He immediately fell back on his training, not the kind from the police academy, but the kind learned on the streets. Control the narrative. He was becoming aggressive, Your Honor, Miller shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Jamal, who hadn't moved a muscle. He was posturing to stand up. I felt threatened. I acted to maintain order and control in the courtroom. It was an absurd, pathetic lie, so transparently false that it insulted the intelligence of everyone who had witnessed the event. Jamal was seated, handcuffed, and had done nothing but whisper 3 words. The idea that he posed a threat to a fully armed, 220-pound police officer was laughable. "Threatened?" Judge Collins shrieked, her voice cracking. "He is a juvenile defendant in handcuffs at a defense table. Bailiffs, take Officer Miller into custody for contempt of court. Now!" The bailiffs, looking uncertain but compelled by the direct order of the judge, began to advance on Miller. Miller, realizing his career was imploding, took a step back, holding up his hands. "Now hold on a minute," he protested, his voice a desperate bluster. "I am the victim here. He provoked me. You can't just—" It was in that precise moment of chaos, the judge shouting, the bailiffs advancing, Miller protesting, Jamal sitting in stunned silence, that the heavy oak door at the rear of the courtroom swung open. The man who entered was not large or imposing in a physical sense. He was of average height, lean, and wore a simple but perfectly tailored navy blue suit. He had short cropped hair, flecked with gray at the temples, and a face that was calm, intelligent, and utterly unreadable. He carried a thin leather briefcase in one hand. But it wasn't his appearance that commanded attention. It was his presence. He walked with a quiet, deliberate confidence, an economy of motion that suggested immense discipline and purpose. As he began to walk down the central aisle, the noise in the courtroom seemed to recede, as if his very presence was absorbing the chaos. Judge Collins, distracted from her tirade, glared at the newcomer. "This is a closed session. Who are you? You cannot just walk into my courtroom." The man in the suit did not stop walking. His polished black shoes made almost no sound on the worn linoleum floor. His eyes, a piercing shade of dark brown, scanned the scene before him, taking in every detail with an almost supernatural speed. The enraged judge, the belligerent cop, the advancing bailiffs, the shocked lawyers, and finally resting on the boy at the defense table with the bright red handprint on his cheek. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of something intensely personal and powerful, a fusion of cold fury and profound pain, crossed his face before being suppressed back into professional calm. He stopped directly in the center of the courtroom, equidistant from the judge, the prosecutor, and the defense. He placed his briefcase on the floor beside him with a soft click. He looked directly at Judge Collins, his gaze respectful but unwavering. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the residual tension like a surgeon's scalpel. It was a voice accustomed to being heard, to being obeyed. "My apologies for the intrusion, Your Honor," he said, his tone perfectly level. "My name is David Hayes. I am a special agent in charge with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." A new wave of shock rippled through the room. Prosecutor Riley's eyes widened. Officer Miller's blustering protest died in his throat. Judge Collins stared, momentarily speechless. David Hayes then turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon the disgraced officer. "I am also this boy's father." He pointed a single, steady finger at Jamal. The silence that followed was no longer just the absence of noise. It was a tangible thing, a heavy blanket of astonishment and dread that smothered the entire courtroom. In that moment, the tectonic plates of power in Courtroom 3B had just shifted, violently and irrevocably. The title, Special Agent in Charge FBI, carried an almost mythical weight. It wasn't just a job. It was an identity that connoted a level of authority, security clearance, and institutional power that dwarfed everyone else in the room, including the judge on her bench. The revelation that this man was Jamal's father transformed the situation from a simple case of courtroom contempt into something far more serious and complex. Judge Annabeth Collins was the first to recover. She was a veteran of the bench, and while she was stunned, her judicial authority was still paramount in this room. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice now measured and cautious, "while your position is noted, you are still interrupting a legal proceeding. Your son's case is being adjudicated." David Hayes gave a slight, respectful nod. "I understand, Your Honor, and I have no intention of interfering with your courtroom. I am here merely as an observer. However, recent events seem to have escalated the situation. Events I believe the Bureau will now have a vested interest in. His gaze flickered over to a visibly sweating Frank Miller, who was now being flanked by the two bailiffs. Miller's face had gone from red with rage to a pasty, sickly white. The name FBI was a terror to local cops, especially those who skirted the edges of the law. It meant federal oversight, wiretaps, and investigations that couldn't be quashed by a friendly union rep or a compliant IA detective. Prosecutor Mark Riley, ever the opportunist, saw the direction the wind was blowing and immediately tried to distance himself from Miller. "Your Honor," he said, standing quickly, "the state is, of course, appalled by Officer Miller's actions. This behavior is unacceptable and does not represent the values of law enforcement. We would support the court's contempt charge and recommend an immediate internal investigation by his department." David Hayes allowed a ghost of a smile to touch his lips. "That is very commendable, Mr. Riley, but I'm afraid a departmental investigation will no longer be sufficient." He knelt down and opened his briefcase. Inside, it was lined with neat tabbed folders. He withdrew one, labeled Miller Frank P. He stood up and walked calmly toward the prosecutor's table. "As part of my duties with the Bureau's Civil Rights Division," David began, his voice still unnervingly calm, "we sometimes monitor officers who exhibit a pattern of behavior that suggests a disregard for the constitutional rights of citizens. Officer Frank Miller has been on our radar for quite some time." He placed the folder on Riley's table. "Inside that file, you will find copies of the 12 civilian complaints Ms. Jenkins tried to reference earlier. You will also find sworn affidavits from two of those complainants, a Mr. Robert Henderson and a Mrs. Elena Garcia, both of whom were prepared to testify in a federal civil rights lawsuit that was in its early stages. Their stories bear a remarkable similarity to my son's. A trumped-up traffic stop, a verbal escalation based on the driver's perceived lack of deference, followed by false charges of resisting arrest." Riley stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. David Hayes wasn't finished. He turned to face Judge Collins. "Your Honor, Officer Miller perjured himself on your stand this morning. He claimed his body camera and MVR malfunctioned. This is a common tactic used by officers wishing to avoid creating evidence of their own misconduct. However, what Officer Miller did not know, and what my son did not know I had done, is that 6 months ago, after reading about a string of questionable traffic stops in this district, I installed a high-end, hardwired dash cam system in my wife's vehicle, the one my son was driving." He reached into his suit pocket and produced a small, solid-state memory card. "This card contains a 4K, crystal-clear video and audio recording of the entire traffic stop. It shows the officer's initial approach. It captures my son's polite and compliant demeanor. It clearly records Officer Miller escalating the situation after my son lawfully inquired about his detention status. And most critically," he paused for effect, his eyes locking onto Miller, "it shows the rear of the vehicle and the right taillight, which you will find is, and was, in perfect working order." The courtroom was utterly silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Sarah Jenkins's mouth was hanging open, a look of pure, unadulterated shock and relief on her face. Jamal was staring at his father, not just with love and relief, but with a newfound awe. He had always known his dad had an important job, but he had never understood the quiet, formidable power his father wielded. "Furthermore, Your Honor," David continued, turning his attention back to the bench, "the FBI is now opening a formal federal investigation into Officer Frank Miller, effective immediately, for felony assault, perjury, and, most significantly, for a criminal conspiracy to deprive a citizen of his civil rights under color of law. That is a federal crime that carries a sentence of up to 10 years in prison." He let that sentence sink in. Miller looked like he was about to vomit. "My first act in this investigation," David said, turning to the bailiffs, "will be to secure all evidence. That includes Officer Miller's service weapon, his badge, and the patrol car he was driving yesterday. I have a federal warrant right here to impound that vehicle to confirm that the MVR system was, in fact, fully functional." He produced a folded document from his jacket and handed it to the nearest bailiff. The warrant was signed by a federal magistrate. It was ironclad. The game was over. Frank Miller knew it. He had built his career on a foundation of lies and intimidation, And that foundation had just been reduced to dust by a calm, quiet man in a suit who had brought with him the one thing Miller could never overcome: the undeniable, unblinking truth. The arrival of a federal warrant into a state courtroom is like dropping a block of dry ice into a glass of water. The entire environment begins to fizz and boil, the established order violently disrupted. Judge Collins, a creature of procedure and precedent, recognized the document for what it was: a declaration that her courtroom was now the scene of a federal investigation. Her authority had not been usurped, but it was now shared. She looked from the warrant to David Hayes to the ashen-faced Frank Miller. The anger on her face had been replaced by a cold, hard fury of a different kind. The fury of a judge who realizes she has been manipulated, lied to, and nearly made complicit in a gross miscarriage of justice. "Mr. Riley," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "does the state have anything to say in light of this new information?" Mark Riley shot to his feet, his face flushed with panicked energy. He picked up the folder David Hayes had given him and held it as if it were evidence at his own trial. "Your Honor, the state is shocked, absolutely shocked by these revelations. Perjury in this courtroom is an attack on the very foundations of our justice system. The people will not stand for it." He was backpedaling so fast he was practically sprinting. "In light of the evidence presented by Special Agent Hayes, the state of North Carolina hereby moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Jamal Hayes with extreme prejudice." "Motion granted," Judge Collins snapped, not even waiting for him to finish. She slammed her gavel with a resounding crack. "All charges against you are dismissed, Mr. Hayes. You are free to go. This court offers its sincerest apologies for what you have been put through." Jamal felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He looked at Sarah, who was openly crying tears of joy, and then at his father, who gave him a single reassuring nod. But the judge wasn't finished. Her eyes, like chips of ice, settled on Frank Miller. "Officer Miller, your actions today have brought shame upon your badge, your department, and this court. I previously ordered you taken into custody for contempt. I am now amending that. I am ordering you remanded into custody pending formal state charges of perjury and assault under color of law. Bailiffs, execute the order." This time, the bailiffs did not hesitate. They moved in on Miller, who seemed to have shrunk inside his uniform. He offered no resistance as they pulled his hands behind his back and clicked a pair of handcuffs, not the ones he carried, but the court's, onto his wrists. The sound was a perfect, karmic echo of the noise they'd made on Jamal's wrists the day before. "You can't do this," Miller mumbled, his bravado completely gone, replaced by the pathetic whimpering of a bully who had finally been confronted by a bigger power. "I'm a police officer." "Not anymore, you're not," David Hayes said quietly, speaking to him directly for the first time. "You're a criminal who used a badge to abuse the public trust, and you will be held accountable." David then addressed the court again. "Your Honor, with your permission, I would like to have FBI agents transport Mr. Miller. Given the circumstances, we feel it's best to avoid any potential complications or conflicts of interest at the local precinct." The implication was clear. He didn't trust Miller's colleagues to deliver him to a cell without incident. Judge Collins, now fully aligned with the federal agent, nodded curtly. "Permission granted. He is in your custody." David made a quick call. Within minutes, 2 more agents, a man and a woman in similar dark suits, entered the courtroom. They took custody of Miller from the bailiffs with quiet, professional efficiency. As they led him away, Miller passed the defense table. His eyes met Jamal's for a fleeting moment. There was no anger left in them, only a hollow, defeated emptiness. The power dynamic had been completely and utterly inverted. The man who had held Jamal's future in his hands was now facing the ruin of his own. The courtroom began to empty, buzzing with the incredible events that had just unfolded. Mark Riley, the prosecutor, approached David Hayes, his hand outstretched and a sycophantic smile on his face. "Special Agent Hayes, a remarkable turn of events. Let me assure you, my office will cooperate fully with your investigation. We had no idea about Officer Miller's history, of course." David Hayes looked at Riley's outstretched hand, but did not take it. "Mr. Riley," he said, his voice cold and precise, "your job is not to be friends with the police. Your job is to pursue justice, even when it's inconvenient. You had a scared 17-year-old honor student with no record, and you had a 15-year police veteran with a dozen excessive force complaints. And you chose to believe the cop without an ounce of scrutiny. You didn't just fail my son, you failed your oath. Don't be surprised when the U.S. Attorney's Office begins a pattern or practice investigation into the prosecutor's office as well. We will be looking very closely at how many other cases, like my son's, you've pushed through the system. Riley's face went white. His political ambitions, his career, his entire future flashed before his eyes. He retracted his hand and practically scurried out of the courtroom. Finally, the room was empty, except for Jamal, his father, and Sarah Jenkins. The bailiff came over and unlocked Jamal's handcuffs. The metal fell away, and he rubbed his bruised wrists, the feeling of freedom surreal. He turned to his father, the emotions of the last 24 hours overwhelming him. "Dad, I didn't know. I tried to call." David pulled his son into a firm embrace, holding him tightly. "I know, son. I know. I was on a flight back from an assignment in Brussels when your mother's messages started coming through. I landed this morning and came straight here. I am so sorry I wasn't here sooner." "You were here when it mattered," Jamal said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were here." David pulled back, his hands on Jamal's shoulders. He looked at the red mark on his son's face and, for the first time, his professional composure cracked, revealing the raw fury of a father. "No man lays a hand on my son," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "No man. I promise you, Jamal, he will pay for every lie, and he will pay for that." The fallout from the events in Courtroom 3B was not a single explosion, but a sustained, rolling earthquake that shook the foundations of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg law enforcement and judicial systems for months to come. David Hayes was a man of his word, and the full weight of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, when brought to bear, is a relentless and terrifying thing to behold. Frank Miller's downfall was swift and total. Denied bail as a flight risk and a danger to the community, he sat in a federal detention center, stripped of his badge and his bravado. The FBI's investigation, spearheaded by David Hayes, was brutally efficient. The malfunctioning MVR system from Miller's cruiser was found to be in perfect working order. Its data logs showed a history of being manually deactivated moments before contentious traffic stops. A clear pattern of evidence tampering. Miller's partner, a younger officer named Kevin Davis, was offered a deal by federal prosecutors and quickly turned state's witness. He testified that Miller's malfunction excuse was a running joke in the precinct and that Miller openly boasted about his ability to put punks in their place. Faced with an ironclad case, Frank Miller pleaded guilty to federal charges of perjury and deprivation of civil rights. The state charges of assault were rolled into the plea. The judge, a stern federal appointee, made an example of him. "You did not just assault a young man," she said at his sentencing. "You assaulted the very principles this nation was founded on. You are a disgrace to the uniform you once wore." Frank Miller was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Prosecutor Mark Riley's career was also left in ruins. The U.S. Attorney's pattern or practice investigation, prompted by David Hayes, uncovered a deeply disturbing symbiosis between Riley's office and the police department. They found dozens of cases where questionable arrests from officers with spotty records were pushed through with plea deals, often coercing innocent or low-level offenders into accepting a criminal record to avoid the risk of a trial. Riley was forced to resign in disgrace, and his office was placed under a federal consent decree, forcing widespread reform and oversight. Judge Annabeth Collins was profoundly changed by the experience. The incident shattered her jaded complacency. She became a vocal advocate for judicial reform, championing programs to review police testimony more critically and to provide better resources for public defenders. She personally reached out to Jamal and his family to apologize again, admitting that she had almost become a cog in a machine of injustice. For Jamal, life slowly returned to normal, but he was different. The experience had stolen some of his youthful innocence, but it had replaced it with a steely resolve. He had seen the ugly underbelly of the system, but he had also seen it corrected by integrity and truth. He aced his final exams and accepted the full scholarship to Georgia Tech, but he changed his major. He still loved engineering, but he added a second major: pre-law. He wanted to understand the system that had almost broken him, and perhaps one day help fix it. The red mark on his face faded, but the memory of his father walking through those courtroom doors, a quiet avenger in a navy blue suit, would stay with him forever. The story of the slap heard round the courthouse became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered in precincts and law offices. It was a story about how quickly power can corrupt, but also about how power, when wielded with integrity, can become a force for justice. It was a story of hard karma, delivered not by a twist of fate, but by the relentless, methodical actions of a father who refused to let the world break his son. The system had failed Jamal Hayes, but David Hayes had refused to fail him. And in doing so, he had forced the system, kicking and screaming, to finally, for one bright, shining moment, bend toward justice. The story you've just heard is a dramatic illustration of a broken system and the profound impact one person of integrity can have. While Jamal Hayes had a powerful father to step in and expose the truth, countless others are not so fortunate. They face the same lies, the same abuse of power, but their voices are never heard, and their stories end in plea bargains and unjust convictions. This narrative isn't just about the satisfying fall of one corrupt officer. It's a harsh reminder of the systemic issues that persist in the justice system and the desperate need for transparency, accountability, and reform. It's a testament to the courage it takes to stand up to injustice. Whether you're a scared teenager in a courtroom or an FBI agent fighting from within, if this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it sparked a desire to see a more just world, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this video with others so this important message can spread, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that need to be told. Your engagement helps us continue to shine a light in the darkest of corners. Thank you for listening.